o'clock. Today, Professor Zangwill will make the second lecture of this series. In the last lecture, Professor Zangwill proposed a new framework, that is a dependent framework. The traditional problems like Gettier problems and how to understand the nature of knowledge or other epistemic issues can be tackled, can be dealt with in this new framework. Some notable consequences can be made in this new framework. I think this is a very new topic. Dependence is a very new topic for us, and even though I'm doing metaphysical works, the topic of dependence is still new to me. In the recent 10 years, especially in USA, many people are doing work on grounding. Grounding is the notion is closely related to ontological dependence. So it is a quite new topic. So I think we have learned so much from last lecture from made by Nick, such as we know from the lecture that the nature of knowledge should not be understood as giving necessary and sufficient conditions for the notion of knowledge, but to ask what is the dependence relation between knowledge and other non-epistemic properties, conditions, states. Also, we know from the lecture that the dependence of knowledge or any dependence in a framework should be not a necessary one, but just a contingent. And the dependence relation can be realized multiple. So yeah, and Professor Zhang will also make distinction between negative and positive facts and the dependence framework among different kinds of facts. We have learned so much, and today Professor Zhang will make the second lecture concerning traditional problem that is skepticism and realism, or dogmatism, as the Zhang will call it. That is the debate between skepticism and realism, how to understand the debate. Is skepticism more reasonable or realism more reasonable? So maybe from a different framework we can get some new light on how to understand this topic. Okay, let's welcome Professor Zangwill to make the second lecture.
Thank you very much again. Perfect introduction. I couldn't have said it better. It's a completely perfect description. And it's true that the last time we had the more general framework, and what you have in this topic, or in the paper that you have, is a sort of application or a consequence of it. I think it is a good or a nice consequence, or it is insightful, but this was published last year, and the one I gave yesterday will be published next year. So, but this is how it is sometimes. Things get published in the wrong order, but that's just how it is sometimes. It's a bit random. Yes, so skepticism is something you've all probably come across in philosophy, maybe in your first week that you ever studied philosophy. Everyone begins with this problem, I think, most people do. Very familiar, and I certainly did, and it's one of the things that gets people into philosophy. Because you get interested in this problem. And it's a lot of fun it's a fun topic. You know, maybe we are now dreaming. Maybe I am a victim of Descartes' evil demon. How do I know I'm not? How do I know I'm not dreaming now? And when you teach philosophy, you know, if you teach this material, that you will get the students interested. This is a way to win them, some students. Because it is immediately appealing, this idea. It's a puzzle, a natural puzzle. A strange puzzle, typically philosophical, in that it seems common sense, and the reasoning seems very ordinary, and then you end up with a crazy conclusion. And that's fun and interesting. And most people who are philosophers have gone down that path, and they enjoy the intellectual sport of thinking about skepticism. But you might remember from your undergraduate days, many people, they get very interested in this puzzle. Other people think, if this is what philosophy is, it's very strange. Maybe I will do something else. You really seriously talking about this question of whether we're now dreaming, or we could be a brain in a vat on a different planet, or we are a victim of an evil demon and we're not sitting here in this room. That can also seem completely crazy idea. And usually those people leave philosophy. They think, what's all this crazy argument? I always, in my past, I was on the first side, but I've begun to see the second point of view now. I'm beginning to think I agree with the non-philosophers, the people who think philosophy is too crazy, that we shouldn't take these arguments seriously, and there is no good reason to take them seriously. So I have taught philosophy for 25 years maybe, and I've taught these arguments many, many times. And I get the students puzzled, and like in Socrates, you get the students to go, I don't know what to think. It seems that I don't know whether I'm not dreaming. And the students panic, and it's great fun as a teacher, because you can lead them into this situation, and then they're stuck. They've fallen in the mud, and then as a teacher, you enjoy leaving them in this dirty place, not knowing how to get out. It relates to an issue we had yesterday about inside the room, the philosophy room, and then outside in everyday life. Because of course, it's the old point we make that, you know, inside the room, we take skepticism seriously, but then you walk outside the room and you don't think, you know, you're going to fall down. Your skepticism disappears when you have to act. This is a point again in Hume. And the problem is how to bring them together, I suppose. And it's not really satisfactory in philosophy to have a big discussion of issues about skepticism, but then have nothing to say about everyday life, where it seems that not only do we not take skepticism seriously, but we don't have to. You know, when we're walking down the street here and we see a car or a bus coming towards us, we don't think, do I have reason to believe that I should jump out of the way? The philosophy disappears very quickly, and you at least assume that the skeptical arguments are no good. But are you wrong to do that? See, if you're too intellectual, too academic, you might think, well, the person jumps away from the car as it comes down the street towards them, and you jump on the pavement because the big car is coming. Are they being is the ordinary person or the philosopher outside the study, are they being irrational? Is there something wrong with the way they act or not? So I suppose, I think it's not that satisfactory. You need to bring what you say about this puzzle into connection with how we act in everyday life, which is what Hume tried to do, and perhaps he didn't succeed. So I think I want to lead you to that situation where we can be quite commonsensical in the end. And many times philosophy, many times not just philosophy, but intellectual life, generally, sometimes we step away from common sense. So in common sense, is this notion familiar to people, common sense?
Yeah.
What most of us think we get from our mothers and fathers and from people around us, or we inherit somehow, maybe what's inborn. A lot of that may be true, but sometimes we do think that common sense can be wrong. So we allow that physics, for example, tells us some crazy things in relativity theory, for example, which are not common sense. The view that we get from Einstein is deeply strange, and it gets even worse with quantum mechanics. So, you know, really, there's nothing sacred about common sense. But still, I think in philosophy, when we go to say that common sense is in error, we need to have good reasons for that. Now, of course, Einstein did have very good reasons for saying that common sense is wrong about space and time. I presume you all know about the Michelson-Morley experiment. I'm sure that I may be insulting some people, but so here you've got the Earth, and here you've got the Sun, and this is just really low-level physics. I'm sure most of you know this. This is 1893. There was this experiment, and here's the Earth, and here's light from the Sun hitting the Earth, and the Earth is rotating, and the light hits the Earth there and here at the same speed. Yeah, that's the Michelson, and so no one knew what to do until 1905, when Einstein published the theory of relativity. So I mean, so we had to really change, and they kept doing this experiment. It kept coming out the same way. The speed of light is the same as you travel towards it, and if you travel away from it, it hits you at the same speed. Now that's just weird. But the world we live in can be pretty weird. Okay, so, but in that case, you have a good reason for thinking that common sense is wrong. You're forced to say things which maybe on an Aristotelian view is more common sense. But sometimes we've got to, this gives you a good reason. But with skepticism, are these arguments really good reasons for thinking that there's something wrong with our ordinary view, that we're sitting here in this room and that there's no problem, we know that we're here, and that the idea that we might be dreaming is a kind of stupid idea somehow. what are you talking about? Why should we take this seriously? Okay. So what is skepticism? Okay, so let's get a bit clear about what this is, and you can find this in this paper. But so skepticism is, let's make some distinctions. It's a negative view. It says we do not have knowledge, or we are not justified in what we believe. Now, there are more complicated versions of this. For people, maybe some people here have done the history of philosophy. You know ancient Greek philosophy quite well. When I was writing this paper, I also had a discussion of Pyrrhonian skepticism. I don't know if people have studied Pyrrhonian skepticism from the ancient, from about after Plato. Are people familiar with Pyrrhonian skepticism, do you think?
I know a student who is now doing Pyrrhonian skepticism in San Francisco State University.
Okay, so are the students familiar, the undergraduates? There's two kinds of skepticism, really. There's
what is the Chinese translation?
那个
you know.
我一下想不起来它什么名，反正就是Pyrrhonian 就是好像是芝诺吧，不是芝诺，是那个皮。等一下，我查一下 Pyrrhonian。皮浪是这样。
Okay, so there's so when I was working on this, I was thinking that the argument applied to all kinds of skepticism, but I had to change my strategy because I started talking to a colleague who's an expert in ancient Greek philosophy, and this Pyrrhonian skepticism is really very different. Although sometimes, and there are many different forms of it, and it went on for many centuries. They were discussing this, I think between 300 and 200 BC, around then, and there was many schools. So, so I'll just say so that the skeptic says we do not know, or we are not justified in believing that we are sitting in this room. The Pyrrhonian skeptic says something like, we don't know whether we know or not, or we should not say whether we know or not. We should withhold judgment. Okay, so I'll just mention that because it's a slightly different view. We should not have any view about this question, about whether or not we're dreaming. Whereas the skeptic, as I'm taking it, the skeptic says we definitely do not know, or we definitely are not justified. Okay, so it's this claim that we don't have knowledge, or we don't have justification. They're not quite the same. Knowledge and justification are different. Just to remind the undergraduates, if you know something, it must be true. But it doesn't. If you're justified in believing something, it doesn't follow that it's true. So knowledge entails truth, whereas justification does not entail truth. That's just to remind the undergraduates here. So justification is they're slightly different notions. And as you may know, that there's an issue about whether justification is necessary for knowledge. Anyway, that's another issue. But I'm taking skepticism meant to make these claims. Either of these claims, we don't know, or that we're not justified in believing that we're sitting in this room. Then there's another version where, and a lot of the arguments say that we might be wrong, or it's possible that we don't know, or it's possible that we're not justified, or it's impossible for us to know anything. Knowledge is not just we do not have it, but some skeptical arguments have the conclusion that we cannot have knowledge, that knowledge is impossible. Now that's a slightly different claim, it's stronger. We do not have knowledge, and it's impossible for us to have knowledge. That's a stronger claim. And sometimes the non-skeptic, what I'm calling the dogmatist, says we know some things, and also it's possible for us to know some things. Okay, there's a slightly different claims. Okay, and I make various distinctions here. You could say that it could be some people can know things and other people don't. So sometimes people say of belief in God that some people have experiences of God, mystical experiences. So maybe they can know God. They can, because they have experiences, and other people cannot. So you might make these knowledge claims about some people and not others, or skeptical claims about some people but not others. A man cannot know what it's like to be a woman, you might say. It's just impossible. You could be a skeptic, or vice the other way around. You could, or if you've not had certain experiences, you cannot know what it's like. So these might be claims that were relative to people. And it could be that some claims you could be a skeptic about some subject matters and not others. You could just be, so many people are skeptical about the external world. Traditional skepticism, like Cartesian skepticism, is not global skepticism because he's skeptical about the existence of the external world, but he knows the contents of his own mind. So it's not total skepticism about anything, it's just about some subject matters. So people normally assume you're talking about knowledge of the external world, and then some of the arguments are relevant to some kinds of knowledge but not others. But some people also say are skeptical about self-knowledge. Maybe if you're Freud, you might say, well, many things about ourselves we can be wrong about. But then there's a question, can you be wrong about your immediate experience? So typically skepticism says, look, I know for sure that I'm looking at some students, a table, and a camera. And I know that's how I know for sure that's how my experience is, and then the problem is reality actually like that? But it's assumed that you can have knowledge of your experience, and that's part of the way the traditional problem of the external world is set up, as a contrast between cases where we do not, or we may not have knowledge, and other cases where it is assumed that we do. Okay. So now, one last point here, which is relevant to the strategy for undermining skepticism, which I'll give to you, is that the things you can have knowledge of might include knowledge. So this, you have these operators, this knowledge. So usually we know that P, but then or we don't know that P, but you can also do this. You can say, do you know that you know that P? Or are you justified in believing that you know that P? So it gets a bit crazy, but it's important to make this, to be clear what you're claiming. This is very important to the anti-skeptical strategy, Because if you claim this claim, okay, you might claim we don't know whether or not we know that P. Now, but that doesn't seem to obviously entail that we don't know that P. So there's different, basically, there are different orders of knowledge. There's first order claims, you know that you know something. Second order, you know that you know it. For first order, you're justified in believing it. Second order, you're justified in believing that you are justified in believing. Or maybe you're justified in believing that you do not know. So that would be, you can mix up these. You can say you're justified in believing that you don't know the P. So you've got second order claim about a negative first order claim. So you can put these operators in front of each other and make more or less complex claims, which are first order, second order, third order, fourth order. Okay. So there's a lot of different claims here you can make about knowledge. Now, let's come to the arguments. So, skeptics often give you an argument, don't they? You remember in your philosophy class, when you were in your first year of study, maybe even your first week, they would say, many arguments. Well, you're in this room now, you're in philosophy. I presume your teachers said something to you like this. Here you are, you think you're in a philosophy seminar in Wuhan, in a room with a table and an English-speaking visitor is, you're listening to a visitor, English-speaking visitor giving a lecture about skepticism. But if you were still, perhaps you've overslept, you are still maybe living in your dormitory here, on campus, and you have slept, and this is actually a dream, and things would be exactly the same for you. From your point of view, your experience would be the same. Well, since your experience will be the same in either case, not only do you not know that you are in a philosophy seminar and not still in your dormitory oversleeping, but also you have no justification in believing that you are here in a philosophy seminar rather than at home sleeping more because your alarm did not go off. So you have no justification either way because your experience is the same. So you have no reason to believe one hypothesis over the other. So I remember when I used to teach this, I used to teach in Oxford University, that's right. The students would all, they would all make the claim, some of the things they were reading made them very happy because the students would read that it's possible that we are in a skeptical situation, right? It's possible that we are a victim of the evil demon, or I am still asleep, or mad scientists have kidnapped me and put my brain in a vat of nutrients on another planet and fed me these experiences. That's possible. And what that means is our beliefs and our knowledge is not certain. We could be wrong, and though there's a possibility of error, but still it's very likely that it's not the case, but it does mean that our belief is not certain. Because there is this possibility that we're wrong. But nonetheless, we have more reason to believe. We have reason to believe that we are here. It's likely, but not 100% likely. So this is very common for undergraduates. They go for this. They say, yes, please, I'll have that. But in fact, that's too easy, because given that the skeptical argument actually seems stronger than that, I'm arguing the opposite way from here. I want to set up the problem. Because it seems that your experience, in fact, it's not that it's 95% likely or 99% likely that you're here. There's 1% chance that you're still asleep in your dormitory. You're still asleep, your alarm has not woken you up. In fact, given that your experience would be the same in either way, you have equal reason to believe either hypothesis. You've got two hypotheses, common sense hypothesis that we're in this room, or the crazy skeptical hypothesis, and each hypothesis is equally supported by your evidence, which is your experiences. So am I doing a good job now as your undergraduate, leading you to skepticism? Because it seems that we have no reason to believe that we're sitting in this room rather than at home dreaming, or being a victim of Descartes' evil demon. So so that's got you, I've tried to hook you into the skeptical situation. I'm trying to remind you of when you came across this as an undergraduate. But now that you see, I've got you in a situation where you've accepted that the lack of a difference in your experience means that you don't know. So if you are accepting this argument, it can only be because you have accepted that that our evidence would be the same in either case, and that we've got no reason to believe one hypothesis over the other. Therefore, we don't know, or we're not justified. So you have accepted a non-skeptical view about knowledge. So you have, in being seduced by that argument, you can only be seduced by that argument if you are second-order dogmatic. So you must accept that where there is no difference in your evidence, you are not justified in believing one rather than the other. That's a second-order dogmatic claim that you have assumed. When you say, oh, I see, my experience will be the same in either case, so I don't know, you have assumed that knowledge requires or depends on there being some evidence that makes a difference. So you've got this second order view here. You've assumed that we know that we don't know. So knowing, you're assuming something about what knowledge depends on. Sorry, let me. Okay, so knowledge depends on something here. So knowledge depends on something like being able to distinguish two cases, for example. And when you are arguing for skepticism, you're making an assumption about what knowledge depends on. So knowledge, so it makes, perhaps it's something X. So my argument, my skeptical argument, I say to you, I try to persuade you that you don't know something, but only because you're assuming that knowledge depends on something here, X. And then I persuade you, look, we don't have X, right? We're not in a situation where there's X. We can make a distinction between real life and dreaming, for example. So we don't know. So my skeptical argument there assumes this. Right, so that means you can only be skeptical by being second order dogmatic. That's the basic move of this paper. And if you look at skeptical arguments, they all make that assumption. You argue that, so there's an assumption about what knowledge requires, or what justification requires, and then you say, we don't have that, so we don't know. But you can only follow that argument if you make that second order assumption that you know what knowledge requires, or you know what justification requires, or you're justified in believing what justification or knowledge requires. So that move, so you can't be a skeptic. If you try to be a skeptic, or you accept a skeptical argument, you can only do that by being dogmatic, anti-skeptical. So let's run through some ways, let's run through some examples. So you might say, suppose you're having an experience, so I'm on section 3 if you're following this. Suppose you have an experience and you say, that experience justifies me in believing something, or means that I know it. And then you say, but that experience would be the same whether or not we were really here. Or suppose you have a claim about what knowledge requires. Any claim. Or justification. So I think that I have some theory of knowledge. Some theory. And I say, well, I know I'm standing here because I can experience and feel the table or something like that, and I can see it and it all fits together. What's the problem? A skeptic might then come along and say, well, no, that's not a good argument for thinking you know it. Right? But the word, why? So I could then say, yes, it is. And they could then say, no, it isn't. And then I can say, oh, yes, it is, like children. The question is why, who has the superior position here in what they claim is what knowledge requires? So the skeptic is making certain claims about what knowledge requires, dogmatic claims, and the dogmatist is also making dogmatic claims, And it seems at least they are on a level there. They both have dogmatic views about what makes for knowledge or justification. Now they might say, well, how do you know that makes for knowledge? That's a different question. So what happens all the time when you follow the skeptical literature is you get what's called level confusion. So there's a philosopher called William Alston. Very important to read this guy. This paper I recommend here, what I really recommend is that you read this paper. That's the most important thing, from 1980. And sometimes people say, you can see it when you read it, the skeptical arguments. What's the conclusion? Is it you don't know anything, or usually you have no right to assert that you know something? That's a different claim. And if you shift back between these claims, you get a confusion. So, actually sometimes this position can be, you could even accept that. You could accept that we don't know that we know anything. Why is that skeptical? It's perfectly compatible with knowing things. It could be these two are compatible. We know things, but we don't know that we know them. Or it could be that we don't know that we know, but we can know that we know. But because of this very important principle, this is called the KK principle, it's not the case that KP implies KKP. It's not the case that if you know something, it implies that you know it. This is called the KK principle. Almost everyone accepts that, because it would be, if it did, it would be completely crazy. It would entail that if I know that this is a pen, it would imply that I know 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 that this is a pen, which is weird. I don't even have that many beliefs, that many orders of beliefs, so I certainly can't know this, because knowledge entails belief. So, get rid of this principle, that seems wrong, and then you can never argue, if you get rid of that, from that to that. From that against this, because this is a first order claim and these are second or third or fourth order claims about knowledge. So I don't mind being a skeptic in a way. I don't mind accepting that I don't know that I know that I know that I know that P. What I care about is whether I know that P. And if I accept that I don't know that I know that I know, or I'm not justified in believing that I'm justified in believing that I know, that I'm justified in believing that I know that P, that's no pressure on whether I know that P or I'm justified in believing that P. So there are these upper level claims, and you cannot descend down the orders of knowledge. Okay, so let me make one last point now about. Well, let me first distinguish. Let's look at one skeptical argument though to distinguish justification from knowledge. Suppose. Let's get back to the skeptical philosophy lecture. So we're discussing whether or not we know we're in this room and there's a philosophy seminar going on, right? And you might think, well, you have certain experiences, and then, but they would be similar in a skeptical hypothesis. A skeptical hypothesis, you're dreaming, you're a victim of Descartes' evil demon, you're a brain in a vat, whatever the skeptical hypotheses are. So you've got common sense, skeptical hypothesis. Well, suppose we are, suppose you are in a skeptical hypothesis. What's your situation there? Right. So suppose we are dreaming, or we're a victim of the demon. I think you're justified in believing in that situation, and not everyone thinks this. I think we don't. If we were in a skeptical hypothesis, then we wouldn't know, because we wouldn't be here. Right. Well, sometimes you could be dreaming. You might be in this lecture. Well, the complicated case when you're in this lecture and you've fallen asleep, dreaming that you are in a philosophy lecture, because that's a kind of weird case in which happens to be true, but you don't know it even though it's true. But that's an unusual skeptical hypothesis. The usual skeptical hypothesis is that you're dreaming and that you're at home, or you're an evil demon and that has got you and you have no body. But in that situation, you do not know. So you've got your actual situation. In this skeptical situation, you don't know. But I think that you are justified, because justification does not entail truth. So I think if you are at home dreaming that you're in a philosophy seminar, I think because of your evidence justifies you in believing that you are in a philosophy seminar. But you don't know it because you're not. Okay, so there's a weird difference there between these two epistemic concepts, knowledge and justification, because one entails truth and the other doesn't. So I would then be dogmatic and say, you have your experiences, and those experiences suffice to give you justification for your beliefs, even though you're asleep and dreaming. But your experience don't suffice to give you knowledge, because at least you need truth for that. Forget the case where you're in the lecture and you've fallen asleep. That's complicated. Okay. So let me look at something now, just the last point I want to make, which connects up with some issues we had yesterday, which is that a lot of these arguments, skeptical arguments, appeal to possibilities. So this will come to your point that you raised at the end last time. Very common to argue, very common to say, look, we could be wrong, so we don't know. Right. There's a possibility that we are dreaming. And you cannot deny that that's possible, because how many times have you had a dream? You've fallen asleep, and you've had a dream, and you believed it was real. That has happened to you. Clearly it's possible, in some sense, that you are now dreaming. Okay. No one should deny that that's possible. Okay. In your situation now, there's your experience and there's the world, and you can have one without the other. Or the world could be different from the way your experience represents it. The gap between experience and reality, there's your experience, there's reality, and then they can come apart. So you can have one without the other. So it's possible that you are now dreaming given your experience. Your experience is one thing, whether or not the world is like that is another thing. So there's a possible disconnection between the two. And then you argue, well, since you might be wrong, you don't know that you are in this room. So that's the step of the argument I don't get. And I always used to get, so for years, decades, from even when I was an undergraduate, that seemed to be a good move to me. You could be wrong, so there's a problem about knowledge or justification. I think this is the point you came up with, and I was always sympathetic to that idea. But why? Why is that move persuasive? Of course it's possible. Why is the possibility relevant to whether I know? So suppose, compare morality. Suppose I've done something good. Suppose I've done something good and I've given a stranger directions. So a stranger was lost. In London there are lots of tourists, they come and they're saying, where is my hotel, where is my bus? So sometimes I stop and say, you're lost. Where do you want to go? Go that way. And then you've done something good. Okay. So what makes that action good or bad if I ignore them? What makes it good or bad is what you do, right? What you actually do. What's possibility got to do with it? Right. So philosophers, they love to play this game. They're talking about strange possible worlds. They say, you know, they make some philosophy claim and then they say, well, but there's a possible world in which you have 7 heads and, or some claim. A lot of philosophy is like this, and you read this, they're talking about, it's possible that, and I'm now thinking, well, I just don't get, why are you talking about this irrelevant thing? Because what's relevant to whether we know, or whether we did a good action or not, is the actual world. Yes, it's true. So this is how things actually are. So I'm sitting here and I'm actually having an experience of this table. I could be a victim of the evil demon while brain with that. So what? And I just don't get why that's relevant. It has to be that this skeptic is saying, well, you would have to have your beliefs in this other possible world. But why is that even plausible? That's a dogmatic claim. Firstly, that's dogmatic claim the skeptic is making. And secondly, it has zero plausibility. Because what's surely relevant to whether or not I'm justified or not justified is how things actually are. What's possibility got to do with it? What makes for knowledge? So knowledge or justification, so that's the state of being. Right now, I have knowledge now. Actually. It's not that I might have knowledge, because I know what my name is. I know that, I know today's Thursday. I know lots of things, and that's an actual fact about me. Right? So I think it's very common sense, and crazy to deny, as skeptics do, that what makes me know things is some fact about me now. Or suppose even that I don't know something. Suppose I don't know, suppose it's a Chinese festival this weekend. It could easily be some festival, I don't know. There are festivals, there's in different calendars, and maybe I've just flown in from abroad, there's some tradition that I don't know about. What is it?
Wednesday.
Wednesday, is that, what is the next Wednesday?
Women's Day, right?
International Women's Day.
Women's Day. Oh, actually, I do know about that, because they're having, in my university, they're having some big festival. But that's international, I think. I think, but maybe there's some Chinese, there's a Moon Day sometime, isn't there? Isn't there some festival when you do lanterns and, I don't know, there's some, maybe that's a different time of year. There's different festivals you have, and I might, so I don't know that, I'm ignorant. But why is it that I'm ignorant? What explains my lack of knowledge? Well, I've had no information, actually, about that. It was not in my diary. So my diary has many details. It has, for example, tells me when Ramadan is, the Muslim festivals. It tells me the Jewish and the Christian festivals. It's in my diary that I have. But it doesn't tell me about Chinese festivals. And that's an actual fact about my diary. And no one has told me. So that's an actual fact about me. It's not some mere fact about what's possible. This is what my diary is like. I can show you. It's printed. It has these dates in it. It says that Ramadan, the Muslim festival, starts on these dates. The Jewish festival starts on these dates. The Christian festivals start then. But there's nothing about many other cultures. And that's... So there are actual facts which explain why I know or am justified, and also actual facts which explain lack of knowledge or lack of justification. So I just don't understand what these, why the appeal, why in philosophy, because so many times they appeal to possible worlds to show things about actuality. So there's something strange there. And this came up yesterday. I suppose generally I believe in metaphysics. If you make a claim about possibility, anyway, the claim is usually rooted in your view about actuality. So I'm going against a lot of philosophy in the last 30 years, where, especially the philosophy of mind. So if you've done the philosophy of mind, we can imagine the possibility of zombies, creatures just like us but with no experiences. We can imagine this, we can imagine that. This is possible, that's possible. I just don't see those as being good arguments anymore. I can't see how they're relevant. So as an example I have, I mean this wall here, suppose I'm talking about this wall. I say, look, this wall's white. It's slightly off-white, maybe cream colour, but say it's white. And you say, well, it could have been blue. So the wall could have been blue. It might have been painted a different colour. So what? So what? It's white. So I'm sitting here in this room. I'm standing in this room. I can see the table. I can feel it. I can see it. I can even hear it. I know there's a table here. Oh, I could have been on a different planet, surrounded by space aliens. And they've taken out my brain. So what? And this is incredibly common, but it's actually a crazy form of argument, I think. I can't see... So I've really given you things as this kind of regress point. That there's a certain point in which a lot of these arguments you will be dogmatic at a certain level, and therefore your skepticism will be self-refuting because you can only make the skeptical argument by being non-skeptical at a higher level. So I've made that move. The skeptic makes assertions about what knowledge depends on and then says, well, we don't have that. so we don't know, and that's asserted dogmatically by the skeptics, so they're not skeptics all the way, because they're second-order dogmatists. And then this point here is when you're thinking about what does actually, what should go down here, why should knowledge or justification turn on being modally invulnerable, so that if we go to all these other possible worlds in which things are completely different, we would still somehow know that we're here in this room. I just don't see the relevance of the appeal to possibilities. It just doesn't seem to me plausible that what should go down here is all sorts of claims about what is possible. What matters is actuality. So suppose I know something due to a causal chain between me and the world. That's a very common theory in the causal theory of knowledge. Right. Now I think it may not be right, generally, but it's a good theory. Right. It's a good theory because suppose I know that there's a cup on the table and there's a causal chain, but the cup is there's a causal chain between the cup through the light reflected from it, which causes my experience, which causes me to have beliefs about it. That's all an actual fact. That's all that. None of that is a claim about a possible world, a merely possible world. So I think that's a kind of good theory, and you can then, I suppose, then there are consequences about possible worlds where you slightly change how things are in the actual world given the causal story. So there are some consequences for what's possible, but what's possible then is explained by what's actual. Right? So actuality, what's actually the case, is what's relevant to what gives you, what means the case that you know you're justified, or even that you don't know and not justified, or are not justified. Actuality is what's relevant for that. And if there are claims about possibilities, they only are relevant because the possibilities are thrown up by what's actually the case. So I can, the way that, for example, this, it's possible to not to dissolve this pen in water, but it is possible to dissolve sugar in this water because of what sugar is actually like and water is actually like. There's an actual nature of sugar and water, right? And that actuality explains the possibility of dissolving sugar in water. So actuality comes first, and possibility depends on actuality, and also our knowledge of actuality usually comes first. So I don't like this procedure in philosophy where you start off with some thought experiment. Especially in ethics, they do it all the time. Trolley problems, crazy thought experiments. And are we even built to know what to think about some of these cases? I mean, sometimes you have these crazy thought experiments in ethics about there's a fat man on a trolley, you're pushing him from a distance. Who knows what to think? Do we have to have a view about it? It's fun. So I'm spoiling the party. So sometimes you have a party and someone spoils the party. You're having fun. You're playing party games with balloons. I turn off the music. Stop having fun, I say. So in a sense I'm being like that. I'm saying, look, it's fun to think about possible worlds and have fantasies and be imaginative about what could be the case in another possible world. But I don't think that it actually tells you very much about what's actual, and it doesn't, in epistemology, it's not the way to go around arguing about whether we have knowledge or whether we don't have knowledge. If we have knowledge, it's because of some actual fact about us, and if we don't have it, it's for the same reason. Some strange possible world is actually not relevant to the question of whether we know in the end. So I think that almost all skeptical arguments do that. They talk about either, so skeptical arguments that I've seen, they either are self-refuting because they're dogmatic, or they're irrelevant because they talk about something which is just not relevant to whether or not you know or you don't know. So this is why your friends who didn't go into philosophy were right. Okay, that's it.
So then the time for question and answer.
Yes, I do have a question concerning the argument that the skeptics somehow must rely on an assumption of what knowledge is and what is our exact standard of knowledge. But I have a question that somehow a defender of the skeptics may say a skeptic argument is quite like abductio ad absurdum argument, in which a skeptic may have a presumption of what knowledge is, but the argument might lead the skeptic to refuse the assumption and to lead the skeptic to the conclusion that we don't have a really exact definition of knowledge, and we don't have what is called a real knowledge. It's kind of like in mathematics when we want to know whether square root 2 is actually a irrational number. We can begin by assuming that the square root 2 is a rational number, and we can follow the argument to the conclusion that the square root 2 is actually not a irrational number. So even though the skeptic might have the assumption of what knowledge is, even though his or her argument might depend on that assumption, his or her conclusion might not depend on that conclusion. So I want to know what's your response to that line of thinking.
Yeah, it's an interesting line. I think that might be Pyrrhonian skeptic, because the Pyrrhonian skeptic, I think the way some of them would reason is that you use your opponent's reasoning against them, and you don't assert anything yourself, but you say something like, well, you realists or non-skeptics, you dogmatists, you take this for granted, but you refute yourself. So they try themselves not to say anything themselves, just to use their opponent's arguments against them. So your idea is in a reductio ad absurdum, you assume something, which is what your opponents think, and you deduce a consequence from that, but you don't assert the what you assume. But surely, if you do a reductio ad absurdum, I mean, you assume, you make an assumption, and then you draw, you assume the opposite of what you want to conclude, and then you argue that it has some consequence, and then you end up with the conclusion the opposite of what you assume. But then surely you are committed to that. You are committed to that following from that. So in using a reductio ad absurdum argument, although you don't accept the antecedent, you do accept the conditional. So you've got to. So I could get the your kind of skeptic there, it's a slightly different kind of skepticism, but they still assert that this follows from that. So you're skeptic. I think it's an interesting kind of skepticism. I think you're Pyrrhonian. They say, I'm not saying anything. I'm just assuming what you're assuming and showing that it leads to these conclusions that you don't like. But then they are asserting or believing that conditional. But there's another kind of skeptic that says, I'm not assuming it, but you are. But I just wonder what you say to that. It seems like you could still, they're making this conditional assumption.
I'm thinking that it obviously differs when what kind of the skeptics he or she is, but you might think that a global skeptic is more likely to be a Pyrrhonian skeptic.
Sorry, what you said again?
A global skepticism is more likely because if you are not global skeptics, you might have a standard of knowledge which you would likely not to refuse. Maybe that kind of skeptic might still admit some kind of knowledge is still available, but other kinds of knowledge is not, and that might not use the abductio absurdum argument so smoothly. So
you see, I'm inclined to say this. Look, that see, one kind of skepticism says, look, we've Pyrrhonian skepticism. They might say, look, I'm not asserting that we don't know. I'm just saying, don't judge. That we have no reason to think that we know, no reason to think that we don't know. So we should withhold judgment. But then, if they think, so they've then got a conclusion which they're asserting, we should withhold judgment. So they're both saying that their opponent, but also they themselves should just not make any judgment about whether they know or don't know. But then that is something they're asserting. That of judgment, we should not make a positive or a negative judgment. We should not say that we know or that we don't know. We should be neutral about that. But that claim that we should be neutral, why are they asserting that? They're saying we should be neutral because the evidence points both ways, or does not clearly point one way or the other. That is again, so they're not saying that we know or we don't know, they're saying we should withhold judgment because the evidence doesn't point clearly either way. But then that whole claim is something that that Pyrrhonian skeptic seems to be asserting. Now, there's some Pyrrhonians who keep trying not to say anything. I mean, you might know that Pyrrho himself, so he was a leader of a group of skeptics in ancient Greece, and he refused to believe anything, and he had his students follow him around, so telling him whether there were any, they would try and get him, because he would think he had no reason to believe anything or not, or didn't have any beliefs. But they would sort of tell him when the equivalent of cars was coming towards him. He would think, well, why should I move or not? I don't have any beliefs here. So it was a kind of comic situation. But again, I mean, I think these are very interesting other arguments, but it seems to me that if you claim we should not judge one way or the other, that's still something we are doing. And it's a policy which is supposed to be justified by the lack of evidence either way. So bang, they are making dogmatic assumption. So I can't see how you can avoid this. But The reason I didn't include, I cut out all this material about exactly this line of thought that you've got, because there's some skeptics who have a strange view about belief. In the end, it comes down to a view about believing, and they think you can go around without actually believing anything.
Yes.
And it's a very confusing idea, but obviously the skeptics were very aware of these moves that I'm making. And I read them for the first time about 2 years ago, and I was completely amazed at how clever they are, ancient Greek skeptics. And all these moves I'm making, some of them knew, and they were trying to change their situation, so they didn't actually commit themselves to anything. Or didn't actually commit themselves to having some reason not to commit themselves to anything. And some of them, I'm not sure that some of them don't succeed, but some of these skeptical arguments, you can get them for making dogmatic assertions. But it's an interesting, certainly very interesting line of thought. But I don't think the reductio idea is going to help them.
I think reductio doesn't have to be a Pyrrhonian skeptics, because the reductio can lead to a positive result. For example, that the square 2 is actually a irrational number. That's not a Pyrrhonian position. That's a positive position. But there's only some kind of connection, but not necessarily.
Yeah, they sometimes use that reductio, they sometimes don't. But the reductio only works because you're committed to the conditional. So if you do a conditional proof in logic, you start off with an assumption, you deduce something from that, and from that you can deduce the conditional. So if you assume A, and you can deduce B from that by logical deduction, then you can infer if A then B. Because that's how the conditional works. It's slightly complex. It depends on the modal force of that. That's interesting.
You agree that if somebody knows P, that entails P is true, right?
Yes.
But do you agree if P is true, that would entail P can't be wrong? No.
No, I don't agree with that. I don't think that if you know it, that's a scope distinction. You need brackets. Necessarily, so deep breath. Deep breath, open bracket. Necessarily, if you know something, if you know that P, then P, close brackets. That does not entail that P is necessary. Okay. It's just, So, necessarily, A implies B. This does not follow necessarily B.
So that's the end of my second question. Because if you agree that the entailment, then I think maybe we go something backward, and I will get a conclusion that you don't know P. But you disagree with the entailment.
I think you think. So I think you think. That if you know that P and P is true, but I think you think that if you know that P then the belief that P couldn't have been false. Something like that. No, wait a minute. You think it's not possible that you believe that P is true while you don't believe P, or you do believe P and that P is false. This is something like Nozick's view. So you think there's a necessary connection between P and believing that P. But that if P were false, you would not believe it. I think that's what you think.
Yes. What I think is, if I say I know something, I know it for 100% degree.
Yeah.
And if I know it for 100% degree, then it can't be false. If it can't be false, but maybe it might be false.
It can't be false. Given that you know it, of course it's 100% certain that P.
And then
that's true.
That's
it doesn't
true.
follow that P.
Necessarily P is true.
It doesn't follow. No, that can't follow.
I get your point.
That can't follow. I think you. Yeah. Yes. Given that you believe that, I think you think there's a connection between believing that P and P, so that it's not possible that you believe that P and P is false. That P is necessarily true given that you believe it, not just that you know it.
Given that you know it.
Well, yeah.
Maybe a bad question?
Yeah, no, it's
Do you mean that from the definition, if I have knowledge that P, then P is true.
Then
But
P is
your
true.
doubt is suppose that I have knowledge that P, then is that necessarily that actually is true. So the question is from actually P is true, whether we can infer that necessarily that actually is true.
Not exactly. And I mean that if P is true, then P is true for 100%. And if P is true for 100%, then
There's no difference. P is true. What kind of percent truth?
then P can be wrong. If P is true for 100%.
sometimes you can have a probability which is conditional on something. But given that you know it, it's 100% likely that it's true. But something doesn't have just a probability. Unless, I mean, you might know God or mathematics. That you know P in those cases does entail that P is necessarily true, because what you know is a necessary truth. But then suppose you know that 2 and 2 is 4. It's not necessarily true that 2 and 2 is 4 because you know it. It's anyway necessarily true because of but the question is, I mean, you know, we're back to this modal question which you raised last time, of whether there must be a necessary link. Of course there's a necessary link between knowledge and truth, but I think what people want is, you know, back to this question of here's my experience and there's the world. There seems to be, there's a contingency there. The world is one thing, my experience is another. But what you want to, maybe the thought is, when I know something, there is not a contingency, there's a necessary link between me and the world. But, and that's where you get Nozick's tracking theory, which is involves these conditionals and counterfactual conditionals. But why isn't it enough, this is back to yesterday again, why isn't it enough that there's a causal connection in many cases? Why does it have to be a necessary connection? So suppose, I mean, there's a sense in which a causal sense in which, well, there's given that the glass is there, the cup is on the table, the paper cup, and everything is normal, and there's a causal route between my experience via the light waves and that cup. There's a sense in which I'm caused to believe it, and because that causal relation obtains, in nearby worlds in which the laws of nature are as they are, and that cup is on the table, I will also believe it, but not in crazy possible worlds. So there is a kind of... So the causal relation does generate some connection to some possibilities. So there is some necessity in some sense. I have to believe it. How could I not believe it? I'm sitting here in front of the cup, so I must believe it because I'm having these experiences. Well, then you say, oh, but you know, like Superman coming in again, or me being subject to a skeptical illusion. I suppose in some sense that's possible. But in a looser sense of possibility, given by the actual laws of nature and how things actually are, look, I could say to you, if you don't drink water for a month, you will die. You must die. And that sort of is a must. I would say you must die if you don't drink any liquid. And that's you must, not in some very strong metaphysically necessary sense, like mathematical necessity, but just given the laws of nature which we assume and what human beings are like. And of course, if you turned into a different kind of being, if you became an extraterrestrial space alien, then maybe you wouldn't die. But there's a certain ordinary sense of which we speak of necessity in this kind of context and in the context of knowledge, where we do think there's a necessary link, but it's not this strong philosopher's sense of necessity. It takes you across many possible worlds, but not all of them. And that was actually Nozick's insight in many ways. But Nozick's mistake was, pointed out by Colin McGinn, but he leaves the conditionals and the counterfactuals as primitive. So that's Nozick's, whereas what you want is a theory which explains why the conditionals and counterfactuals hold. So in a causal theory of knowledge, there's a causal relation between me, my belief, and the fact that I know, and that causal link, in normal circumstances, if A causes B, in normal circumstances, that goes along with if A then B, and if not A then not B. But of course there are some strange philosophers' cases, where something is waiting to do it anyway, or you can preempt the cause. There are lots of fun cases where that doesn't follow, but in ordinary, everyday cases, A causes B, you have conditionals and counterfactual conditionals following that. And in an ordinary sense, you can say it's necessary, or it's not possible that you believe that P. It's not possible that, I'm having these experiences, but the cup's not there. We would say that in an everyday sense of possibility, where that's not the strongest philosopher's sense.
So, I remember Kaplan in 1970s made a distinction between context of use and he calls circumstances of evaluation.
Yes.
Possible words.
Yes.
And he can make to two-dimensional semantics. One is the actual context, and the other is the possible words.
Yes.
And similarly, I'm thinking that maybe you are committing to kind of two-dimensional epistemology. Two-dimensional. The first dimension is our actual world, and second one is the possible world. It's possible. Everything is possible, right? So
I would
do you
like to
agree?
be. I would like to be committed to one-dimensional
Why not?
semantics. I think 2 dimensions is 1 dimension too many. Yeah, for me,
But your point is very similar.
I think because I'm hostile to possibility and modality, whereas 2-dimensional semantics is friendly to modality.
You're not friendly to.
No, I'm not friendly to possibility and 2-dimensional semantics. No, I think that I think partly go back to, if you talk about Kaplan, and so this revolution in philosophy in the 60s, and and then you have Donnellan and Kaplan, and then Kripke and Putnam. I mean, how is meaning fixed for these people? So I see these people